In the formation of the movement, based on Gülen's writings and example, as we heard in the earlier session, there's a repertoire of options. There are different ways in which people who, like he, would be orthodox in his faith, Sufi versions of Islam, and wanting to do what he's out to do, educate, stimulate international business occasions, represent religion along the way. And I think there are three options that we're seeing around us in the world today. When you have the other around, you destroy the other. The opposite would be convert. That is, try to make everybody like yourself. Is the movement out to do that? Some people are suspecting it. Some would see it a betrayal. You certainly betray the nature of civil dialogue if you convert a dialogical session into an attempt to convert the other. And the third option would be merger, fusion, taking all the elements that you can and coming about to a single thing. But I think that Gülen's humanism, richly informed by his piety, his knowledge, his concern, provides another model. The anti-Muslim Americans, and there are many of them, who seek political advantage from it or just speak out of fear or ignorance, when they hear the Gülen explicit Sufi Islam, they say, you know, aha, we caught you along the way. The doctrinaire Muslims, on the other hand, say you're bartering away everything that's important to us. He says, any attempt to speak without speaking any particular language is not more hopeless than the attempt to have a religion that shall be no religion in particular. Thus, every living and healthy religion has a marked idiosyncrasy. Its power consists in its special and surprising message, and yet the energizing and the motivating and the enduring power in Gülen's case and others come from what he calls the strange and idiosyncratic stories that we tell. So what are you going to do when you have these differences along the way? And the answer that you get from Gülen is tolerance, but not only tolerance. I've chosen the word, and I distill this also in his writings, a much better and stronger word, hospitality. That is not only a habit, it is grounded in an approach to life and a set of beliefs that I think carries over, and he makes a great deal of it. On the one hand, secularistic-like, people in doctrinaire and ideological politics are thoroughly convinced that he is out to subvert them by replacing it with a jihadist regime. And the militants in other nations, and the few that are in Turkey by comparison, again, as I said earlier, think he's giving the game away. And there's never a page in his writings where he can say, now finally we're on that great plain where there's nothing there. It's the human condition. It's simply if you live as intensely as he does and thinks as intensely as he does, he's alert to it from that perspective. And I think it's so interesting that the Gülen movement has spent so much energy not in politics, which is only one form of civic engagement, but in voluntary activities, in education, in philanthropy, in business, in charitable work, and so on, because there too you are not exempt from all these forces that are pressing upon you. We need models, and in this field I would argue that what Gülen has achieved beyond his own movement and scope is to serve as a kind of a model.
It began in 2006 when I had the great honor, the great privilege of having our first trip to Turkey. And I had been thinking for some time, I wonder, is there a way of using our kind of tribal peacemaking methods to help include the common ground of ethical, caring, compassionate business people, the people who believe in stewardship, the people who believe in relationship, who believe in the long term and not just short-term profit? Isn't there a way to bring that to a principled approach to business negotiation so that the fundamental driving spirit and principles of Sharia can be honored without actually having to say the word? And so we end up now with this project where in our second year, we met in Istanbul. And my husband, the professor of world religion, who's much bolder than I, said, you know, both of us agreed, people who are teaching this need to have the experience of community of business people. People who see their world as more than just a balance sheet, as we experienced in Istanbul. There's a key question here. Is it possible in the rough and tumble of the business world to actually try to assume that maybe sometimes when people say it's about principle, that they mean it? Basically, nobody in this group of 24 people ever believed that that was true. Excuse me, once they grew up, as far as they were concerned, and went out in the world, they did not believe it was true, and therefore they never taught it as being true. We were fortunate to be able to meet with the Confederation of Turkish Businessmen, and I went back again a few months later and met some more and did some follow-up questions just to make sure that I was clear and not getting too narrow a picture of it. And what we came up with was, underlying it all, yes, we will try to work in good faith according to our values. We'll also kind of feel out the other side to see if they're in accordance with it. If they're not, we'll switch. Okay? And it comes down to trust God but tie your camel. It was a very personal journey for many people because I must admit I had completely forgotten or not noticed that many people in our westernized American group were not immigrants, or their immigrant story was sufficiently far back that it wasn't part of their narrative or the way they saw themselves anymore, so they didn't quite get that idea of people having multiple identities but still being themselves. It was a very hard sell to get people to understand that just because somebody is dressed in Tommy Hilfiger or Brooks Brothers or whatever, just because they went to the Ivy League schools, that doesn't mean that they have accepted all of your same Western material values. In business, it also required us to take another look at and respect the traditions of Islam and commerce that go back a lot farther than the Uniform Commercial Code in the United States or the World Trade Organization or the European Union. It is something that our Hizmet movement business people helped us with so much. And that was having the courage and the trust in us to articulate, to say out loud the content of the business customs. And those customs, the ritual of hospitality, it was overwhelming. It was like a tsunami for so many of our participants in this experiment, in this dialogue. There are very different things about negotiation, mostly in my paper, but I called them the 3 T's. Tempo, that the pace of everything is much slower. Tea, the 3 cups of tea. Had to explain that. And trust, that all of those are building towards trust so that you have some comprehension of whether this is a person that you want to and can handle having a long-term business relationship with. Is there hope? Does this matter? Yes, it absolutely does. When I look at the poetry, the wisdom, the philosophy, that even if it's just slow but constant, deliberate progress, it matters. And it may seem as if what the Hizmet movement is doing is just a little stream, but that's also the way the Grand Canyon was cut. My speech was, as much as anything else, a thank you to the Hizmet movement, to the Turkish Raindrop House in Oklahoma City, to the connections with the Confederation of Turkish Businessmen for making an incredible opportunity available, a seed for scholars, researchers, practitioners in negotiation and mediation around the world to understand a lot more about what stewardship in business is about. And so that hopefully as we continue teaching people about how business works in different places around the world, we'll have a lot more respect and understanding for the kind of Islamic cultural values that one finds everywhere. And our entryway for that were the Hizmet movement business people. They were astoundingly fine.
In some areas, certainly this is true in Turkey, but I would have to say it's also true in the Western Hemisphere and here in this country, people look at the movement and say, well, it's an Islamic movement. It must be up to something, and it must have some ulterior motive, some intention, and that causes suspicion. The old urban elites feel uncomfortable with recent arrivals from Anatolian villages, and they feel uncomfortable with their culture, their tradition, and certainly their religiosity, and they regard it in some way not only as inferior but even as threatening. Hence there are all these accusations made about movements like the Gülen movement that channels this traditional village religiosity. And it's certainly not an Islamist movement. It's unique. It's unquestionably, in my opinion, a progressive movement. It looks to the future with optimism and hope, even though it draws at the same time on the traditions of the past. But we still struggle for terms and for language to explain how it works. One aspect has to do with financing. As Helen Iba observed in her recent book, people are often asking the question, where does the money come from? Or to use an old Anatolian sort of image, where does the water for this mill come from? You know, what's driving it? Where's it flowing from? We look at the schools, and the schools are the most obvious aspect of the movement, and the schools are, well, they appear to be philanthropic, but they also charge fees. Some of them have quite high fees, and some of them are quite fancy. We look at the educational activities, and this is the key contribution of the movement, and struggle to try and know how to define them. We look at Fethullah Gülen himself, and it's difficult to know what to make of him. I would suggest the thing we need to understand is that he's not claiming to be a theological innovator. He's certainly a significant intellectual, but he's not making a claim of new ideas. What he is doing, though, and he's very modest, so he doesn't make this claim, but what he is doing is he's found a way of providing concrete pathways to activism for ordinary people. I think, this is the thrust of my paper, something that might help us in this regard is to understand the Gülen movement in the language that the Grameen Bank founder Muhammad Yunus uses. He speaks of, he's been described as a social entrepreneur, but he says, look, I would rather describe what I'm doing as social business. And I think that this social business model maps over very neatly into describing particularly the Gülen-inspired schools, but many of the other activities as well. I'm not suggesting that the social business model by any means fully accounts for how the Gülen movement works. I mean, we're discussing at this conference the religious ideas and inspiration and spiritual values. Those things are very important, and I fully agree with that discussion. I'm just suggesting that when it comes to the day-to-day functioning, we can see something from this model. I think beyond the financial models, there's other things that Fethullah Gülen and Muhammad Yunus have in common. And I don't want to press this too far, but it seems to me, although they're very different people in very different spheres, they have some similar convictions about human society and human nature. And one of them is they both have a very strong sense of hope. Hope has gone temporarily out of fashion in America, but let's hope it comes back quickly. I mentioned that the particular genius of Fethullah Gülen is providing this immediate pathway to engage a plumbing supply owner in rural Turkey with building of schools in Africa. I think that a part of the way that's worked out is this model, which I suggest could be described in terms of social business. Muhammad Yunus and Fethullah Gülen have very different languages. I mean, they come from different spheres. Yunus is a professional economist, a professor of economics turned accidental banker. Fethullah Gülen is a preacher and theologian who's come into the business of inspiring social movements. So obviously Yunus speaks in the language of economics and business. It's very secular. Fethullah Gülen is much more inclined to speak in the language of spirituality. But despite that very significant difference, there's some surprising parallels. Yunus is working closely with very poor rural people, and Fethullah Gülen is mostly reaching out to people who are urban-based and educated, and reaching out in a way that involves spiritual terms and language. I don't think that Muhammad Yunus and Gülen have ever met, and I suspect they don't know much about each other. I don't doubt that Fethullah Gülen is well aware of the Grameen Bank story, but it's unlikely they've ever exchanged any contact. And yet it's interesting that coming from very different perspectives, they've arrived at I think, a common point in the way that we address the needs of society. We want to understand the business dynamics of how many of the Gülen movement enterprises, so-called Hizmet enterprises, work. We could look at the model of Nobel Prize winner Muhammad Yunus, founder of Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, who suggests we start businesses deliberately to meet social needs, not to make money. These are not-for-profit businesses, but we try and do our social engagement work in a self-sustaining fashion. So that the businesses will pay for themselves and we can keep on expanding. And I think with the Hizmet schools we see something that's strikingly similar. The reason that there are fees and the reason that costs are paid is because this is not simply charity. There's so much need in the world that needs to be met that if we just take a charitable approach we'll soon run out of money. It strikes me as a particular stroke of genius to recognise that if we set out deliberately to meet social need but find a way of making it self-financing, we can do so much more good. And so I'm suggesting we might look at that model as a way of explaining what the Hizmet does.